Welcome to session 6 of our class on the Conquest to the Divided Kingdom. We want to, in this session, begin with some special issues in the book of Judges. The first one concerns Israel's organizational structure. At the end of Joshua's life, he gathered the Israelites for his final addresses and a final covenant renewal ceremony in Joshua 23 and 24. Representing each tribe were the elders, heads, judges, and officers of Israel. Throughout the book of Judges, judges are raised up to deliver Israel from its enemies. In the case of Deborah and Barak, the victory was a triumph on behalf of the entire nation. At the end of the book, we see the tribes banding together to confront the tribe of Benjamin. Considerations such as these and many others have given rise to speculation about the precise nature of Israel's organizational structure during the period of the Judges. A proposal by one commentator made in 1930 has defined the discussion ever since. Studying evidence from Greece in the first millennium BC, this man concluded that Israel's 12-tribe system was formed on the analogy of the Greek structure, the classic example of which comes from Delphi in central Greece, dating to about 600 BC. This was a religious association of 12 members revolving around a shrine at Delphi. This association was pledged to a peaceful coexistence and a common defense against outside aggression. It met yearly for religious assemblies and affirmations of the ties that bound it together. In the years since this man's proposal, many other tribal leagues of various types have been explored, many much closer to Canaan than Greece. The 12-tribe Israelite system, revolving around the place that God would choose, which originally was Shechem and then was moved to Shiloh after Shechem's destruction by Abimelech in Judges chapter 9. This system seemed naturally to fit this model. It met occasionally. The Israelite organizational system, they met together occasionally to affirm the covenant, and a system of common defense seems to have been in place. Now, this is a logical enough proposal in many ways, and the hypothesis has had many adherents ever since. But the model that was presented has been widely criticized, especially in recent times. Among the most telling criticisms has been that the primary characteristics of the Greek associations was a central shrine, whereas the specific number of its members was secondary. That is, it was not always 12. On the other hand, the man who presented this theory of using the Greek system to understand the Israelite system, he elevated the number 12 to primary status since the biblical evidence is very unclear about the precise status of the Israelite shrines at Shechem, Shiloh, or elsewhere during this period. Also, despite much circumstantial evidence, this man and others gathered, the fact remains that nowhere in Joshua, Judges, or Samuel is such an organization mentioned at all. Indeed, the emphasis, especially in Judges, is precisely that there was no centralized authority, political or religious. Many of the Alternative proposals follow in the general direction charted by this man, but propose different bases for the organization, modeled after examples closer to Israel in time and geography. Now, what should be clear is that the biblical writers were not so interested in political or religious structures per se, and it would be a mistake to read the book of Judges with the question of organization as the primary concern. The book's main theme is Israel's relationship to God and God's character in responding to his people. The period clearly is a transitional one, showing Israel between its status as a landless people entering a new land, newly released from captivity, as found in the book of Joshua, and its status as an established political entity with national boundaries and a king, as found in 2 Samuel. Its political and religious organization in all three periods, however, is not nearly as important as the relationship it fostered with the Lord under whatever system. Okay, just a second here. All right, had a little bit of something I had to check. Next, let's notice the issue of the office of judge. As we stated earlier, the judges of the book of Judges do not fit the modern conception of a judge. That is, they did not normally hold court, listen to complaints, or make legal decisions. Now, Deborah is the exception in chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. Rather, they were primarily leaders of Israel, delivering the nation from foreign threat or oppression. A key to understanding them is provided in the book itself. We've already looked at chapter 2 and verse 16. Let's notice it again. And the Lord raised up judges who saved or delivered them from the hand of those who plundered them. Now, no individual is called a judge in the book. The only time the term is used in that way, it refers to God in chapter 11 and verse 27. This is a significant part of the book's message. It is the Lord who is the true judge of his people, and he controls their fortunes, both for blessing and for punishment. Now, many scholars have seen a distinction in the roles or offices of judge. They have divided the judges into two categories. The major judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson, are seen as charismatic military leaders whose primary function was to deliver Israel. And the second category are the minor judges, Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. These are seen mainly as juridical leaders whose major function was to dispense justice. Now, the man that we mentioned earlier, I didn't give his name, Martin Noth, N-O-T-H, is the one who came up with this idea of using the Greek model of organization. And he used that to help him understand, or at least in his mind, to understand the Israelite organization. Well, he spoke of a particular office for the minor judges who were part of this structure and only later became combined with the charismatic heroes. Again, this is what he and others are proposing. However, the case is not as clear as Noth and others would suggest. For one thing, his formulation depends heavily on his hypothesis of this organization as the specific organizational structure binding Israel together in this period. And this hypothesis, as we said, has been severely criticized. Second, there are good indications that there was not such a radical distinction between what has been termed as the major and minor judges. For example, the account of Jephthah occurs in the midst of the accounts of the minor judges, carrying many features of these short accounts, yet he is clearly a major judge by virtue of his activity. Also, both Othniel and Tola in chapter 3, verses 9 and 10, and chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, not only judged in the sense of dispensing justice and wisdom and so forth, but they also delivered Israel. Therefore, we conclude that all of the judges had some sort of a military function in delivering God's people. Even though several of the minor judges are not said specifically to have delivered Israel, we need not conclude that they did not do so in some way. The book certainly appears to be selective about the information related, even about the judges it includes. Some or all may have had juridical functions as well, but this was only secondary. The terms major and minor are useful only in describing the length and style of the narratives that inform us about each judge. For example, Shamgar rates only 2 verses in the book, chapter 3, verse 31, and chapter 5 and verse 6. And the last verse there is simply referring to the events of the first verse. Thus, he is included in the group of minor judges, not because of what he did, but because of the amount of space that he is given in the book. Now, let's deal with the placement and function of the first chapter and chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. The first section of the book of Judges, this chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 5, introduces us to the states of affairs during the period immediately after the death of Joshua. And it forms the basis for the summaries of the book's message found in chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. 2 issues arise concerning the relationship and context of this section. Number 1, there is the relationship of this passage to the book of Joshua itself and its relationship to Judges 2, 6 through 10. In Judges 1, verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 5, the prologue here sets the stage and the tone for all that follows. Initially, it shows some continuing military activity there in chapter 1, which indicates that all military conquest had not been completed during Joshua's day. Then it makes explicit the incomplete conquest of several of the tribes. That Israel had disobeyed the matter of the conquest is confirmed in chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, when the angel of the Lord makes this accusation clear. Now, according to one commentator by the name of Brevard Childs, the notice in chapter 1 and verse 1 about all of this happening after Joshua's death shows that a new period in Israel's history has begun. In sharp contrast to the peaceful and unified picture that we have of Israel at the end of the book of Joshua, Judges introduces a less optimistic picture. The breakdown in Israelite society detailed in chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 5 forms the keynote for the book, one that is made more explicit in the balance of chapter 2, which presents the cycles of sin, slavery, and salvation. The book begins exactly as Joshua did, and it happened after the death of so-and-so. In the case of Joshua, it happened after the death of Moses. Here it says, and it happened after the death of Joshua, that such and such and such and such. Now, this indicates clearly the start of a new era. The old leader is gone. We see a contrast here, however, in that no new leader is commissioned to lead Israel. Rather, the tribe of Judah is designated to lead in the fight against the Canaanites. On the one hand, this foreshadows the rather chaotic conditions that would prevail in this period because there was no identifiable leader. On the other hand, the choice of Judah hints at the leadership position predicted for it long ago, back in Genesis chapter 49, verses 8 through 12, and which would come to fruition with the establishment of the monarchy under David and his descendants, who were from the tribe of Judah. Now, one issue that arises regarding the relationship between Judges 1 and Joshua is the incomplete nature of the conquest presented in Judges contrasted with the complete pictures of the conquest in Joshua, especially in Joshua chapter 10. In Judges chapter 1, verse 21 and 27 through 36, we have detailed accounts of land that various tribes had left unsubdued. Now, this contrasts with the emphasis in Joshua 10, which is one of complete and swift annihilation of people throughout the entire region. For example, according to Joshua 10 and verse 40, Joshua subdued the whole region, including the hill country, the Negev, the western foothills, and the mountain slopes, together with their kings. He left no survivors. He totally destroyed all who breathed. However, the contrast is not merely between Joshua 10 and Judges 1. Even in the book of Joshua, we have indications that the conquest was not complete. This is especially evident in chapter 11, verse 22, chapter 13, verses 2 through 6, chapter 15, and verse 63, chapter 16, and verse 10, and chapter 17, and verses 12 and 13, all of which speak of people in the land who survived, who were not driven out. Also, in contrast to the picture conveyed in Joshua 10 about a quick sweep, Joshua 11 and verse 18 states that Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time. Now, because even the book of Joshua gives this more realistic picture, we must understand the statements in Joshua 10 as a sort of stylized summary or a provisional conclusion. Now, some support for this idea can be cited as evidence when it is noted that exactly 7 cities, along with their kings and people, are listed as having been destroyed in the summaries. So the number 7 may be symbolic rather than comprehensive. Now, Judges chapter 1 and verse 1 through chapter 2 and verse 5 and its relationship with Judges 2, 6 through 10 is another thing that we need to understand. A question of chronology arises in these 2 passages, since both of them mention the death of Joshua. Chapter 1 and verse 1 talks about the death of Joshua. Chapter 2, verses 6 through 10, talks again about the death of Joshua. But the second passage presents his death as having occurred after the events of chapter 1. But the events in chapter 1 supposedly followed his death. Now, many scholars see this duplication as due to the convergence of different independent traditions. At least one scholar treats verse 1, the first part of it, after the death of Joshua, is what it says. He treats this as a title to the entire book. And he sees the events in chapter 1 as all taking place before Joshua died. Thus, in this understanding, the account of his death in chapter 2 and verse 6 through verse 10 is correctly placed chronologically. And this suggestion is attractive since it resolves the problem of 1:11 through 15, which essentially duplicates Joshua 15, 15 through 19. However, the grammatical construction in verse 1 is a common one, demanding that the reference to Joshua's death be read in conjunction with the words immediately following, not detached from them. Thus, the judgment here is that chapter 1 and verse 1 is correctly placed, and most of the events in chapter 1 followed Joshua's death. Thus, the reference in chapter 2, verses 6 through 10, about Joshua's death is out of place chronologically. It is what we might call a flashback, so to speak, that is inserted at the beginning of the second section of the book, chapter 2, verse 6 through chapter 3, verse 6. It duplicates Joshua 24, 28 through 31, almost word for word. And its purpose is to tie closely the material that follows the book of Joshua. Indeed, one commentator by the name of Castle has well shown the function of 2, 6 through 10 by aptly titling the passage as an extract from the book of Joshua, showing when and through what occasion the religious apostasy of Israel began. Therefore, we see that the book opens with two parallel introductions, both of which refer to Joshua's death and point us in various ways to the book of Joshua. Both introduce materials that clearly show the contrast between the period of the Judges and Joshua's day. This brings us to another special issue in the book of Judges that we want to cover, and that is the term angel of the Lord in the book of Judges, or the phrase angel of the Lord. This phrase occurs some 59 times in the Old Testament. 1/3 of these occurrences, that is 18, are found in the book of Judges. Judges chapter 2, verses 1 and 4, chapter 5, verse 23, chapter 6, verse 11, 12, 20, 21, and 22, that is twice in verse 22 it occurs. And then Judges 13, verse 3, 13, 15, 16, and again in 16, 18, 20, 21, and again in 21. In addition, the term angel of God appears 9 times in the Old Testament, at least 3 times in Judges, chapter 6, verse 20, and chapter 13, verses 6 and 9. Now, in all these cases, the two names or titles seem to be synonymous, the angel of the Lord and the angel of God. Thus, there are 4 places in Judges for these terms. Though they do not occur in Joshua, they do appear several times in Samuel. Now, let's talk about the appearances of the angel of the Lord in these cases here. In each of the 4 cases in Judges, the angel makes a sudden appearance, and he appears as the representative of the Lord. In Judges 2, 1 through 5, the angel of the Lord had been at Gilgal and went up to Bochim, and he spoke to the people about their covenant disobedience. In chapter 5 and verse 23, the angel of the Lord uttered the curse on Meroz. In chapter 6, verses 11 through 24, the angel of the Lord came to Orpah, or Oprah and appeared to Gideon to speak with him. He also performed a sign for Gideon, and then he vanished. And then in chapter 13, verses 1 through 25, the angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and to him and performed a sign and then vanished. Now, in the last two cases, in Judges 6 and chapter 6 and chapter 13, when the angel vanished, the humans' responses were similar. Gideon saw that it was the angel of the Lord, and he feared for his life. Manoah knew that it was the angel of the Lord, and he too feared for his and his wife's life. Such a reaction of fear appears to have been rooted in the restrictions in the Pentateuch concerning humans seeing God. In Exodus 33:20, God, speaking to Moses, says, "You cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live." Now, the appearance of the angel was a supernatural appearance, and it is described in Judges 13 as awesome in verse 6. Manoah's wife did recognize him as a man of God in verse 6. However, his essential character, as revealed in his name, was not to be revealed to them. This could mean that it was the Lord himself, or that it was the Lord's close representative. The point here is that in all these cases, the Lord and the angel of the Lord seem to be closely identified with each other. This is confirmed in Judges chapter 6, where the individual who visits Gideon is referred to alternately as the angel of the Lord and also the Lord himself. Compare especially chapter 6, verse 12 with chapter 6, verses 14 and 16. Know also that Manoah's judgment, that in seeing the angel of God, or the angel of the Lord, he and his wife had seen God himself, chapter 13, verse 22. And in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, the angel speaks as God in the first person. Now let's talk about the identity of the angel of the Lord. Because of the close association of the angel of the Lord and the Lord himself, many students of the Bible have wondered about the precise identity of this angel. Essentially, there are three options. He is a true angel with a special commission, number one. Number two, he may be a momentary descent from heaven of God himself into visibility. Or number three, he may be Christ, a kind of temporary pre-incarnation of the second person of the Trinity. The Trinity. Because of the close relationship, even alternation of the angel of the Lord and the Lord himself, it would seem that the first option is not adequate. That is, that it was a true angel with a special commission. Unless the merging or alternating of the two is only in the language used and not in the actual reality. But the angel represents God himself in very real ways. Now, another passage that is a key text in this regard is found in Exodus 23, verses 20 through 23. Here, this passage shows how this angel carries the Lord's character and authority. Exodus 23 and verse 21 shows that the angel has the authority to forgive sins and that the Lord's name is in him. And verses 21 and 22 both specify the angel's authority to speak for God. On the other hand, in Exodus 32, verse 34 through chapter 33, verse 17, we see more of a distinction between the Lord and his angel. The Lord pledges to send his angel before Israel despite their sin in chapter 32, 24, and 33, 2, but he himself will not go with them, chapter 33 and verse 3. This seems to distinguish this angel from God himself. When the passage speaks in 33:14 of God's presence with Israel, it does not refer to his angel, but rather his face, excuse me, that goes with them. As we said earlier, some interpreters take these manifestations of the angel of the Lord to be pre-New Testament revelations of Christ himself. In support of this, the descriptions of an angelic type being, though the term angel is not used, are found in Daniel chapter 10 and verse 6 and Ezekiel chapter 1 verses 26 through 28. These are compared with John's descriptions of Jesus in Revelation 1:14 and 16. Also, it is noted that the angel of the Lord is not mentioned in the New Testament while Jesus is on earth. Furthermore, the fact that Jesus was sent to do his Father's work in John 8:18 is where that is stated. This is compared to the angels also being sent by God. Thus, one commentator by the name of G.B. Funderburk concludes this: only the Logos, that is Jesus, or some other manifest personification of God would be able to speak with authority as if he were God himself. However, we should note that the New Testament, which certainly is not against identifying Jesus Christ with Old Testament figures such as King and Messiah, as priest, or as the Word of God incarnate. The New Testament never makes this identification explicitly. Obviously, Jesus was the self-expression of God in the New Testament, but nothing in the Scriptures requires our understanding God's self-expressions prior to Jesus' birth to have been this self-same person. Another commentator by the name of Thomas McComiskey, his conclusion is probably as close to the truth as we might get. He says, it is best to see the angel as a self-manifestation of Yahweh in a form that would communicate his immanence and direct concern to those to whom he ministered. Now, this self-revelation of God certainly anticipated Christ in a typological way, even if it was not Christ himself. Now, this may be analogous to the way in which wisdom displays remarkable affinities with the incarnate Word as it is used and described in Job chapter 28 and Proverbs chapter 8. Now, let's move on to another special issue within the book of Judges, and that is the vow of Jephthah as found in chapter 10 and verse 6 through chapter 12 and verse 7. This is the section that covers the 8th judge that is found in the book, and his name was Jephthah. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he delivered Israel from the Ammonite threat. Prior to the battle, Jephthah gave an impressive speech telling the Ammonites that it was the Lord himself, not the Israelites, who had taken the land. The Lord himself was to judge the dispute between Ammon and Israel, which he did in a decisive way by giving Israel the victory. The story of Jephthah is not merely about a military victory, however. The story reaches its climax with the shocking episode of Jephthah's ill-advised vow and possible sacrifice of his own daughter. This is found in chapter 11, verses 30 and 31, and verses 34 through 40. In an attempt possibly to garner the favor of the Lord, he promised to sacrifice, and the word is ambiguous here, either whomever or whatever came out of his house to meet him upon his victorious return. Now, the first question that arises here is, what exactly did Jephthah intend to vow? The issue revolves around whether he intended to offer a human sacrifice, whether he expected to offer an animal sacrifice, or whether he was being intentionally ambiguous, intending to offer whatever came out, either a human or an animal, that is, whatever came out of the house. Now, the Hebrew in verse 31 literally states, the one going out, whoever or whatever goes out of the doors of my house. Now, again, some versions and commentators understand the form here impersonally and translate it as whatever, while others render it personally as whoever. In theory, again, either case is permissible grammatically. However, in the context, the strong possibility or probability points to the personal reference. If an animal were intended, the gender of the form in question should be feminine, whereas in actuality it is masculine. Furthermore, the phrase "to meet me" refers more appropriately to a human than to an animal. Thus, it is most likely that Jephthah intended to offer a human sacrifice to the Lord. Now, it might be argued that Jephthah's grief reaction in verse 35, when he learned that he would have to sacrifice his daughter, indicates that he expected to offer an animal. However, that is not a necessary conclusion. Equally plausible is the suggestion that he expected a servant to meet him coming out of the house, who presumably would be more expendable than his daughter. A second question that arises is whether or not Jephthah actually carried out his vow. Now, this arises because the text does not explicitly say that he killed his daughter, only that he did to her as he had vowed. When the verse goes on to say that she was a virgin, some assume this meant that she had merely been sacrificed, dedicated to a life of perpetual virginity, which was to the Lord, verse 30. That is, she was dedicated to the Lord in a manner similar to Hannah's dedication of Samuel. However, the plain meaning of the words in that Jephthah did exactly what he had vowed to do, namely, he offered his daughter as a burnt offering. The verb in verse 39 can easily be understood as a past perfect. That is, and she had been, that is, before she died, she had been a virgin. Afterward, the commemoration of Jephthah's daughter certainly was not a celebration of this awful event, but rather a mourning, grief over this event. Well, obvious next question is, if he did offer his daughter as a human sacrifice, how could a judge who had God's Spirit upon him and who is commended in 1 Samuel 12:11 and in Hebrews 11:32, he's commended as being faithful to God, how could he have done such a thing? Human sacrifice in Israel was expressly prohibited in the law and condemned in the prophets. Jephthah certainly was familiar with Israel's history, which included such prohibitions. The answer simply is that if in fact he did offer his daughter as a human sacrifice, the answer simply is that he was rash, foolish, and he sinned in doing this. If the scriptures were to withhold commendation of people because of some sinful aspect to their lives, then no commendations would ever have been issued, except in the case of Jesus. Jephthah's vow reflects a misguided application of the principle of offering to God the best one or the best of his treasure. It also demonstrated a certain lack of faith, since earlier he had indicated that he believed the Lord would intervene on his behalf, and especially since the Spirit of the Lord already had descended on him before he made his vow. Well, did Jephthah have to follow through on his vow? Well, essentially the answer is yes. Vows were made only to God, and they were solemn affairs that did indeed have to be kept. People were not forced to take the vows, but if they did, they must be kept. Deuteronomy chapter 23, Psalm 15, and Ecclesiastes 5. In the end, although he was used by God and he knew of God himself, Jephthah is one more example of the deterioration of morality and the what we would call the Canaanization of life that is depicted in the book of Judges. In that one sense, Jephthah became like a Canaanite. Now, let's move on and talk about the theology of the book of Judges. First, a major theme of the book of Joshua is Israel's inheritance of the land and fulfillment of God's promises. In the book of Judges, concern for the land remains in focus, but with a difference. Now, the issue is, in Judges, the issue is why Israel had not been able to possess the land completely. The answer comes clearly that Israel's disobedience was to blame in not completely annihilating the Canaanites, and especially in turning to the Canaanite gods. Therefore, we see the concern for the land in Judges being tied to another major theme of Joshua as well, and that is the purity of Israel's worship. The warnings sounded in Joshua were not heeded, and the book of Judges records the consequences. The gift of the land, which was such a prominent theme in Joshua, is seen in Judges as being compromised by Israel's apostasy. Now, the note in chapter 18 and verse 30 about the day of the captivity of the land sounds an ominous warning that eventually even this gift would be withdrawn for a time. Next, under the discussion of the theology of the book of Judges, let's look at Israel's apostasy. Israel's apostasy is the cause of the threats to the land. The text explicitly states this in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, and chapter 2, verses 20 through 22. Repeatedly, we see the Israelites breaking the covenant, turning to the Canaanite gods, and generally doing evil, and repeatedly we see them suffering the consequences. The oppressions, the chaos, and the generally negative picture in the book are due to repeated sin. The next theological theme that we find in the book is God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness forms the counterpoint in the book to Israel's apostasy. Despite Israel's repeated falling away, God repeatedly provided for deliverance. He did not do this unthinkingly or mechanically, somehow manipulated by Israel's cries for help, and he did not spare Israel from the consequences of its actions. Indeed, he angrily delivered the nation into the hands of various groups of people. But rather, he delivered Israel because of his promises about the land. he remained faithful to these promises. We should emphasize that the immediate cause of God's deliverance was not because of any merits on Israel's part, nor even because of Israel's repeated repentance, but rather because of God's compassion and his pity. After a careful reading, one cannot escape the impression that God emerges as the hero of the book, and he acted on Israel's behalf in spite of Israel's faithless character, and that even the judges themselves did not contribute greatly to improvement of spiritual conditions in the land. The judges certainly acted as God's agents of deliverance from foreign oppressions, but most of them exhibited personal qualities and behavior that were rather coarse, even sinful. Note, for example, the coarse but vivid details of Ehud's killing of Eglon in chapter 3, the apostasy into which Gideon led Israel in chapter 8, the poor light in which Abimelech is cast in chapter 9, the rashness of Jephthah's vow in chapter 11, and the erratic behavior of Samson in chapters 13 through 16. Two of the most famous judges were anything but virtuous. After a favorable beginning, Gideon displayed a decided lack of faith in badgering God for a sign of confirmation. And later he made an ephod that became an object of worship and a snare for him, his family, and all Israel. Samson violated all the main provisions of the Nazirite vow imposed upon him. He drank wine at his wedding feast, he had much contact with the dead, and he allowed his hair to be cut. Furthermore, he married an unbelieving Philistine, and he had intimate relations with at least 2 other Philistine women. In general, the judges did not lead Israel in true repentance and in putting away foreign gods, certainly not in the way the reforming kings later did in the kingdom of Judah. The one judge who did the most along this line was Gideon, and did so at the beginning of his ministry, but by the end, he was leading the people in exactly the opposite direction. We should note that the New Testament has a more positive view of Gideon, Samson, and others than we find in the book of Judges. Hebrews 11:32 lists Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, along with David, Samuel, and the prophets, as examples of those who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. However, 2 things should be noted. First, not every one of these heroes of faith did all of these things, as the phrase about lions' mouths shows. These are representative examples of what they did through faith. Second, and more significantly, to say that these heroes had faith in some measure at some point in their lives is not to say that they were consistent models of faith and virtue throughout their lives. Undoubtedly, they demonstrated faith at times that allowed God to conquer kingdoms through them. But just as surely, the book of Judges focuses more upon other aspects of their character to point out the widespread apostasy during the period of the Judges. Next, let's notice kingship in Judges, that is, the case for kingship. The book of Judges argues that Israel needed a king. It presents its case that kingship was something positive in 3 major ways. First, it does so by way of its general outline and structure. Far from presenting us with a series of repetitive cycles leading nowhere, the book of Judges more precisely shows these cycles as a part of a downward spiral leading to a virtual bankruptcy of any positive virtues in the land. This downward spiral applies to Israel's fortune themselves. The enemies at the outset are external, whereas by the end of the book, they are internal. A civil war had just ended. The downward spiral also applies to the religious conditions. The last judges, especially Jephthah and Samson, seem worse than the earlier judges. And chapters 17 through 21 reveal a tangled web of covenant violations as the final accounts unfold. However, the book does not end on a completely hopeless note. For one thing, some good came out of the civil war in chapters 20 and 21. The tribes acted in a unified fashion in confronting Benjamin, and they were even concerned about the continuity of that tribe. A second note of hope points toward a resolution of Israel's problems, and this is found in the editorial comment the editorial comment that is repeated 4 times in the last chapters of the book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. This is chapter 17 and verse 6, chapter 18 and verse 1, chapter 19 and verse 1, and chapter 21 and verse 25. Now, to this comment is added the phrase, every man did what was right in his own eyes. That is added in 2 of these references, chapter 17 and verse 6 and chapter 21, 25. These comments do much more than convey information about Israel's political organization. Indeed, the reader is well aware of this. Rather, the comments make the clear point that things would be better under a king. The biblical norm was that people should do what was right in the Lord's eyes, not their own. Now, the standard for Israel was that a king was to lead the nation in true worship and truly trust in the Lord to fight Israel's battles. You can look especially at Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20. Under such a king, people would no longer do what was right in their own eyes, but what was right in the Lord's eyes. A second way in which the book of Judges speaks to the issue of kingship is in the episode where the men of Israel asked Gideon to rule over them. In this passage, Judges chapter 8, 22 and 23, Gideon refuses the offer by saying that it is the Lord and no other who is to rule over them. Now, this passage is usually seen as one of the clearest statements in the Old Testament against kingship. However, the message here is not that kingship per se is the problem. Rather, the problem is the motivation for the request. It is because they said to Gideon, "You have saved us out of the hand of Midian." That is in direct contradiction to Deuteronomy 17:16 about the Israelites not building up the number of horses they owned, that is, their military power in horse-drawn chariots being the equivalent, the ancient equivalent of what we would have as modern tanks. Okay? They're not supposed to build up these type of things. It is also in direct contradiction to the entire point of the story in Judges 7, 1 through 8, about how when Gideon assembled an army, he cut that down from 32,000 to 300. The point there was that Israel should not boast that her own strength had saved her. Yet the men of Israel asked Gideon to rule over them. Because of this, and perhaps also because it was not God calling him to rule over Israel, but rather the people, Gideon had no responsible choice but to refuse. The refusal is not a statement about the illegitimacy of the institution of kingship, but rather a more limited comment about the circumstances under which Gideon was asked to rule. A third way the book of Judges speaks to the issue of kingship is its perspectives on Abimelech's abortive kingship in chapter 9. Here, Gideon's son Abimelech made himself king by means of a bloodbath. In reaction, Jotham told a fable about the trees of the forest, in which only the lowly thorn bush consented to become king. The point is obviously to compare Abimelech with the thorn bush, and many scholars have concluded that the larger point is that kingship itself was illegitimate. However, one commentator by the name of Gerald Gerbrandt correctly observes that the purpose of the chapter is not to condemn the institution of kingship per se, but rather to indict Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem. Nowhere is Abimelech condemned for becoming king. Rather, his crime is in the killing of his brothers, and he is cursed for this, verses 24 and 56. The larger passage emphasizes the theme of the curse of fire that is to devour the bramble in the fable, is reiterated by Jotham concerning Abimelech and the others, and the conclusion to the passage explicitly points to its fulfillment in verses 56 and 57. And the point of the passage then is not that kingship is a crime, but that when kingship is based on crime and the abuse of force, then the inevitable outcome of such a kingship will be destruction. Nothing in the book of Judges suggests that the final author was against kingship. Rather, he was clearly arguing that things would have gone better under a king. In this sense, then, the book functions as an introduction to and a justification of the monarchy. The end of the book serves as an appropriate preface to the next stage of the larger story related in 1 Samuel, the introduction of the monarchy. All right, our next discussion is going to get us into the text of Judges. And since we're near the point of the end of the hour and we've gone over on some others, we'll just stop right here and we'll pick up with the text of Judges in session 7. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to call me or write me an email. Thank you.